Hi friends, and welcome to The Objective Hindu. In the second part of the series that I'm creating on the Israel-Palestine question, I want to talk about the sort of legal and political angle and explain to you how this particular region got its shape that it did, and what we see today in terms of the modern day nation states. How did they come into existence? The first video we've already talked about the sort of historical and theological context, and then we'll of course finish off with the moral questions in the final video in this series. But let's start with understanding this whole concept of Zionism, which you've likely heard of. I want to spend a couple of minutes on it. So in the early 20th century, a Jew named Theodor Herzl in Europe, I think he's British, he came up with this idea of a Jewish state. He actually created a pamphlet, and he said that we Jews need a state because, well, we've been persecuted and we deserve a home. And while he was long dead before the state of Israel came into existence, or his ideas reached sort of fruition, it did set into motion this conversation around a Jewish homeland, and that idea was then latched on by all sorts of people, the Jews and the non-Jews. The World Zionist Congress followed that particular pamphlet or that declaration that Theodor Herzl made, and they formally adopted this sort of resolution. Now they had no power, of course, so they were an inconsequential body. So they were just a congregation of Jews, mostly European Jews, I might add. But they adopted a resolution that the Jews deserve a homeland. And little do people know that actually they were not even sure of where they want to create this homeland, and today it appears that it was always meant to be Israel in this region of Palestine. But you'll be surprised to know that regions in Greece, in Cyprus, and even in Africa and Uganda were put up for discussion in terms of possible sites for the creation of a Jewish state. So Zionism essentially is this ethno-nationalistic idea which culminates with the thought that the Jews should have a home. But the way I'd look at it is that it's an attempt to create some sort of a shared identity and a shared sense of purpose for what was at that moment a very diverse community. The Jews of Europe, the Jews of Arabia, the Jews of Palestine, the Jews of America had very little in common, and they didn't really have a rallying sort of purpose as Jews, and they didn't have a common identity, and Zionism sought to create that. For any Indians and Hindus in particular watching this video, you can think of the Hindutva ideology in India also being in some ways similar, where it tries to create some sort of a national consciousness and a sense of common identity for Hindus in a very diverse country that India is. So there's some similarity between the two. Now, of course, Hindus have historically continued to live in the region that they've existed, but you'll see that the concepts of even like Greater India or Akhand Bharat, etc., have that sort of ethno-cultural, geographical relationship or dimension to it. So that's Zionism. Now, the British did not really latch on to this idea of Zionism anytime soon, but there was some conversations, and the Zionist Congress and the Jewish leadership started rallying and lobbying with the Brits. Actually, they did this with even other European powers, but the problem was that other parts of Europe were far more hostile to the Jews. So they ended up with the Brits, not because the Brits were necessarily very friendly or favorably disposed to this idea, but they were the least antagonistic to the Jews of Europe, I guess. Now, so that's Zionism. Now, remember, this is all happening during World War I, which I'm not going to talk about in detail. And you can read about World War I. But remember, the British were allied with the French on one side. So the British, the French, and the Russians. And then you had the Central Powers, the Ottomans, the Germans, then the Austro-Hungarians on the other side. Now, based on many factors, the Brits were led to believe, or they were misled to believe, that the Jews could have a consequential role to play in tilting the nature of the war. So based on wrong intelligence, they were led to believe that the Jews in Istanbul and the Jews in Russia could influence their respective governments, in the case of Istanbul, to bring the Ottomans in an alliance or closer with the Brits. And in case of the Russians, remember Russia had gone through the Bolshevik Revolution. They believed, or at least some parts of the British Foreign Office and intelligence services believed, that the Jews in Russia, if the British supported them, could be used to lobby the Russians to stay in the World War. Because remember, the Russians were actually exiting the World War after the Bolshevik Revolution, and the Brits couldn't afford to have the Russians leave, because that would mean that Germany doesn't have to worry about its eastern borders. And then later on, there was another idea around the Jews of America, and whether they can lobby the American government to actually get involved in the war, because Americans so far were very reluctant and reticent and did not want to get involved in anything to do with the First World War, because they were deeply suspicious of the colonial sort of minds that both the British and the French very much were known to have. So the British were, in thinking about Zionism from a totally different viewpoint. They had no particular sort of agreement with the Zionist leadership on why it might be a good idea to create a homeland for the Jews, but they were thinking that, they were, incorrectly as it turns out to be, but they were thinking that if we could give this to the Jews and extract some support from them, maybe they will help us with the things that I just discussed. It turns out that was not the case, and they totally overestimated the ability of the Jews in all these countries to actually do anything meaningful, and they made the same mistake with the Arabs as well, which I'll come to next. So that's just Zionism and how the British got involved. Now we'll talk about how the British declared the support for Zionism in a second, but before that, let's take a step back and just focus on the fact that the British were allied with the French, which I mentioned, and they had a secret agreement with the French called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, under which the French and the British had decided which parts of the Middle East, which were ruled by the Ottomans, will be governed by whom after the Second World War, assuming the Brits and the French won and the Ottomans lost. This was not public information. This was only known to these two countries. So they were very imperialistic in their designs, clearly. The French were not interested in supporting the Zionist idea, because the French thought that this whole program, actually they correctly understood this, that this whole program has nothing to do with the Jews, and it's actually something that the British might use to create leverage in their ability to bargain with the French. And they didn't really want the British to have that advantage, even though they were allies. And lastly, the French, unlike the British, had some connections in that region, in the sense that there were Christian communities in Lebanon and Syrians who were kind of under French protection or tutelage, and the French claims to Syria and Lebanon, which is exactly what was included in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, had some legitimacy, I guess. The British enjoyed no such legitimacy. They couldn't claim that the Arabs are our people. They couldn't claim that the Jews are our people, and neither had they historically supported either of these communities, unlike the French who had. So what the British then did is they actually allied with the Arabs, believe it or not. And who did they ally with? They allied with the ruler of Makkah. His name was Sharif Hussain. And they allied with him as part of the McMahon correspondence, so General Viceroy, I think, based in Egypt, a senior officer. He was also actually Viceroy of India, I think, or Governor General, I can't remember which. But essentially, McMahon and Hussein of Makkah agreed to ally, and what the Brits wanted was for the Arabs to mutiny against the Ottomans. Remember, Makkah and all other parts of Palestine and Syria and even Egypt were under the Caliphate, and so the British were interested in either defeating the Ottomans or forcing them to come over to the British side. That was their main motive, nothing else. And so they wanted the Arabs to help, and in return they had actually made all sorts of promises to the Arabs. They promised Hussein that he would be made caliph. That later they promised his son that he would be made the king of Syria, even though they had already promised the French that Syria would be part of the French domain. But essentially they made promises to the Arabs in terms of Arab sovereignty in exchange for their support against the Ottomans, which was a good strategy, because this is when Arab nationalism was slowly coming to the fore, because they were very splintered and tribal in nature, and they didn't really have a consciousness as an Arabian people. and they were for the most part happy to be under the Ottomans historically, because it was a caliphate and there was the Muslim rule and all that, and they viewed the Brits and the French with a great deal of suspicion. Anyway, so the Brits had allied with the French and the Arabs, and they had made all sorts of promises, including incompatible promises to either party. Now, to make things worse, based on what I've explained about Zionism, the British made what's called the Balfour Declaration, named after the guy who made the declaration, called Arthur Balfour. And I've described some of the reasons why they thought that supporting the Jews would be a good idea. There were other reasons as well. They also wanted to protect British India. Some people in the British Foreign Office and intelligence thought that a friendly state in that region will guard against Russia in the future. Some wanted to keep a check on France. Some, of course, wanted to tilt the Ottomans to their favor. So all sorts of incongruent reasons and pathways, however, led to the support for the Zionistic cause and the Balfour Declaration. And under this declaration, the Britain, very smartly, which is expected of them, promised support for the establishment of a home state for the Jews. Now, if you read the declaration, it's very mildly worded. It's designed to not antagonize anyone, and it also goes on to say that anyone who's already living in Palestine, so this was aimed at the Arabs, who, remember, the British were already in alliance with, anyone who's already living in those regions will not be, their interests will also be protected. So they played both sides. They even played three sides, I'd say, if you count the French. And that's what really came to bite them and the people of that region in the end. So then you had the Balfour Declaration, based on just to really, and by the way, there were some people by this time in Britain who had also fallen for the sort of biblical messianic view. So there was a small but an important part of the sort of British leading elite establishment that actually believed that the sort of biblical promises that I've discussed in the first video are meant to be true, and that that they want to actually support the creation of the kingdom of heaven, etc., in Israel. And fortunately or unfortunately, this included the British Prime Minister Lloyd George, who for whatever reason thought that was one of the reasons why the Jews should have a state. Okay, so let's keep moving on now. I'm just looking at my notes here. When after the Balfour Declaration, between that, the 1917 and the end of the First World War, which is 1922, the British had slowly taken control of Mesopotamia, Iraq, and placed that under the administration of the British Indian Office, of Syria, of Lebanon, and of Palestine. The amazing thing is that all these areas, which were part of the Ottoman Empire, and once the British had taken these over, the Ottomans were almost finished. All these areas the British were able to finally occupy with little to no support from either the Arabs or the Jews. So their calculations in terms of what the Arabs might be able to do or the Jews might be able to do were totally incorrect. But nevertheless, they were still able to go and capture all these territories. So just imagine for a second that you've got almost the entire Middle Eastern region as we know of it today under either direct British rule or in some cases indirect rule, as in the case of Saudi Arabia. The British then appointed one of the sons of of this guy Sharif Hussain of Makkah. His name was Faisal, who was also a British ally. By the way, if you've seen the film Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, he is Faisal's friend. So that entire movie is based on that guy, Lawrence, T.E. Lawrence. He's a real character, and he was allied with this. He was not allied, sorry, he was very close and friendly. He was an advisor to Faisal, who was Sharif Hussein's son. But anyway, the British appointed Faisal as the king of Syria, but only for the French to step in and depose him, because of course, remember, the French had already claimed Syria, and the French knew that Faisal is really a British stooge. So Faisal was kicked out of there, but the British then put him in charge of Iraq, and he later became the king of Iraq, and his successors became the rulers of Iraq. And they actually did pretty well in terms of ruling Iraq in the post-war sort of era that led to the modern country of Iraq taking shape. What else happened? Something very interesting happened. So French moved into Syria, like I said. They took over Syria. They also demarcated the Syrian and Lebanese borders. Iraq took shape under Faisal. Saudi Arabia had taken shape by this time, not under Sharif Hussain of Makkah, but his rival Ibn Saud, the other house, and he had defeated Hussein by now, and the sort of borders of Saudi Arabia and the new kingdom had taken shape. Sharif Hussein actually ran away, and I think he settled somewhere else in some other British protected territories. But he had another son. His name was Abdullah. Abdullah was put in charge of what the British called Transjordan, which I'll explain in a second. Now, this became the country of Jordan. But why was Abdullah put in charge of that region? So this is all part of Palestine, remember, as I've described in the first video. But that region still had some Ottoman troops and maybe some Arabs who were not really friendly with the British, and they were attacking the French in Syria. And the British were worried that the French will cross over into Transjordan, aka Palestine, or Eastern Palestine to be accurate, and take over that region too. And to protect against that, the British put Abdullah there, and his main job was to make sure that that region is not used as a base for incursions into Syria. So that was Abdullah. But when it's very important to understand that when Abdullah was put in there, Palestine was partitioned, and now you have this new emirate of Transjordan created, and actually it occupies around 75% of what was Palestine. One thing I perhaps should have mentioned a minute or so ago, but it will all come together hopefully, is that after the war, the British had extracted a mandate from the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations. And the mandate for Palestine was held by the British. So the British had nominal authority to rule Palestine by law. The French similarly had nominal authority to rule Lebanon and Syria and some parts of Iraq by law. Some people were given some autonomy as well as part of this. The Armenians were given independence, the Kurds were given autonomy, etc. So the British were legally ruling Palestine, and that included Transjordan. So it was up to them to partition Palestine, which they did, and created the Emirate of Transjordan and put Abdullah in charge there. So both the sons of Hussein of Makkah are now rulers. One of them went to Iraq, the other one went to Jordan. And in fact, today the Kingdom of Jordan is called the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, because they claim to be descendants of Muhammad, who was also, of course, from Makkah. Now that left a small region of Western Palestine under direct English control. And believe it or not, even now the English believed that the Arab and the Jewish causes were not at odds with each other. And by this time, the Arab leadership, which was really Hussein, Faisal and Abdullah, as far as the British were concerned, had all settled down. The sons were ruling big empires, and no one really had any desire to get into the remainder of Palestine. So that was a little bit of a forsaken cause and a forgotten part of the region, so to say. Also Syria and Lebanon, which were other important parts of Arabia, had also taken shape and were under French rule. So the British have Palestine and modern day Palestine and modern day Israel, that region, under control. And for the most part, it is believed that Palestinians and Jews can live together in that region under British rule. Because remember, this is much before the state of Israel as a sort of Jewish state came into existence. But what was happening from the time of the Balfour Declaration, and at an increasingly accelerating rate, was that there was Jewish immigration happening into Palestine, and many of these Jews came from Europe because they were being persecuted there historically, right? This massively accelerated in the build up to the Second World War, and obviously by the time the Holocaust happened, all sorts of Jews from all over the world who had nothing to do with Palestine, who had nothing to do with the Zionist program, etc., all of them made their way to Palestine. So there were massive settlements. But before that sort of exponential increase happened, there was slower immigration already happening, and so the demographics were changing. There were settlements happening, even though the Jews for the most part were buying land in Palestine and doing it in quotes in a legal manner, and mostly focusing on occupying areas that were not already occupied by the Arab Palestinians. But once the numbers started expanding and the growth in the Jewish population hit some sort of a critical mass, really the British started to lose control. And so by the 1930s, there were, we had the Jewish population of Palestine, and I'm talking about West Palestine now, not counting Transjordan, had gone from 11 to 31%. So that's a huge change in demographics. And And by this time, there were all sorts of other factors. There was a little bit of rise of Arab consciousness. Nationalism was taking foot in all sorts of countries. India was about to become independent. Other English colonies were also clamoring for independence. And of course, World War II was, while the British won it, it came at a great cost. So Britain had lost its energy, its ability, and maybe its motivation to maintain that sort of control. And of course, remember that the original reasons why they wanted the Jewish state there was to win the war. That was over. The idea of having a colonial strategic interest there, that was also coming to an end because, well, colonialism was coming to an end. So the British really withdrew. And this culminated in two steps. One, in 1939, the British actually sought to restrict immigration into British Palestine of the Jews. So by law, the British said only X number of Jews, they put a quota to kind of prevent over immigration into Palestine, because they could see that the balance of that, the demographic balance of that region was shifting, and that was causing all sorts of problems from a governance perspective, which was still in their control, but increasingly out of their control. Ultimately, in 1947, the British took this to the United Nations and said that, sorry, we can't resolve it, and plus, to be honest, we've lost interest. You figure something out. And the United Nations proposed what's called the UN Partition Plan for Palestine, and they proposed a state of Israel and a state of Palestine. The Jews accepted this, the Palestinians, the Arabs rejected this. Under this proposal, the Jews were to get 58% of West Palestine and the Arabs 42%. Now, keep in mind, this is 58% of the remainder of Palestine after Transjordan has been already partitioned. If you take into account the fact that Transjordan was already with the Arabs, then that would be 85 to 15% in favor of the Arabs. But of course, because Transjordan was already a different emirate and later a country, a kingdom, the conversation was only about the British held Palestine, which is essentially today's Palestine and Israel. So that's what the partition plan was about, which was not really very tenable, to be honest. So I'm not surprised that the Arabs actually rejected it. But Israel then came into existence, and in 1948, 47 was the partition plan, which was rejected, but in 1948, Israel declared unilaterally its existence, which of course the Arabs rejected, and immediately the Arabs in the neighboring countries attacked Israel as well. But more importantly, within 11 minutes of Israel declaring itself as a state unilaterally, the Americans recognized it, and once the Americans recognized it, the rest, as they say, is history. And the sort of power vacuum and the void that the British left, the Americans filled that very quickly, and obviously that relationship between Americans and Israelis has blossomed into some sort of an alliance now. So to conclude, we have a state of Israel today. But what's very interesting is that the state of Israel today is much larger than what the UN partition plan had proposed. And now what we've got is a divided, ungovernable Palestine. And the fact that Jordan was created as a separate entity, I think that killed any realistic prospects of a Palestinian state, because it's a little bit of a geographical jigsaw at the moment. And while the British, among other reasons, wanted Israel as strategic assets, it's actually the Americans who took over that sort of hegemonic mantle and turned Israel into a strategic asset, which it very much is today. But little do people know that Americans were very, very far away from being any sort of ardent supporters of the Zionist cause in the first place. In fact, they totally rejected it. And we tend to forget these things, and we assume that the Jews and Christians had great relations, we also assume that America and Israel had great relations. That's not true. But hey, anyway, their relation has blossomed into a much into an alliance, and the Palestinian question and the boundaries, etc., they remain very hard now to change, especially with Egypt and Jordan and Syria. So all the other boundaries firming up, and none of those countries, being in a position to negotiate or bargain with Israel and the United States. One thing I forgot to mention is that after the creation of Israel, the Jewish settlements in many parts of erstwhile Palestine have increased, and these are considered illegal under international law. So like I said, in the end, the Palestinian state as of today, let's say we create a state today in Palestine, that will be smaller than what the UN partition plan had promised them, which the Palestinians had rejected. So they will be net losers either way. And that's primarily because Israel now has occupied a far greater area than what it originally had under both the UN partition plan and its own plan when it unilaterally declared itself. And this happened, much later in the 60s when they were attacked by their neighbors, and they essentially went ahead and occupied other parts of Palestine, which they saw they needed to do as far as their security and strategic interests are concerned. So having said that, it goes back to what I was trying to summarize before adding this last point, which is that it's a little bit of a mess at the moment, and the geography is such, and plus you've got all these great powers involved, that it makes it almost impossible to bring up a solution or a Palestinian state. We'll look at this in the third video as well in some greater detail, but hopefully at the end of this video you have understood how the nations of Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia came into being, and how their respective boundaries had an impact on this small region called Palestine, which is really sandwiched between them and the sea on the west, and why then the creation of Israel for all sorts of incongruent reasons is in some ways is a little bit of the final nail in the coffin of the remaining Arab Palestinians in the western part of Palestine. Thank you for tuning in, and let me know what you think, and if you had any questions that I've not been able to answer, please feel free to ask them. Otherwise, I will meet you again in the final video in this series, in which we will sort of explore the moral dimension and the question on who's right and who's wrong. Have a great day.